Now that we have some real-world experience using component state, let's go ahead and integrate it into the Indecision app. There's only a few videos left for this section, and we're going to spend those finishing off the main functionality for the component version of Indecision. Now I'm going to take that app.js, I'm going to move it over here, and I'm going to close build it visible and the ES6 classes file. I'll leave this open as a reference if we forget how something works. And the goal inside of here is to take the data like options and turn that into state, because options is indeed going to change over time. Now we know how we're going to do that. We're going to define our constructor. We're going to get those props. We're going to take those props. We're going to pass them up to super. Then we're going to go ahead and define the default state. So this dot state equals an object, and on that object we can put whatever we like. For now, we're just going to have options, and we are going to set options equal to an empty array. Now, before we add the ability to actually get stuff into options, let's just go ahead and use the same dummy data we had before. So I actually am going to start with a few items by default, and this is just a temporary thing. We'll eventually remove these. Now that we have the default options, there's no need to actually use the array down below inside of render. Instead of referencing the options array, we're going to grab this .state.options, which means we can actually just delete this guy altogether. Now from here, let's go ahead and actually save the application file and get it rendered to the screen. The data is going to get passed into options. Options already knows how to pass that data down into option, and option renders the option text. So we should be able to at least see this list showing up. I'm going to go ahead and switch over to the terminal, shut things down, reload the last command, and we're going to switch back to the app.js file, and that file lives in the source folder. So I'm going to remove all of this stuff, source/app.js. Now, if we go back into the Chrome browser, we should see our default state rendering right here. We have thing 1, thing 2, and thing 4. And if I were to go ahead and switch a value in this array, I'll switch this over to thing 3, we can see it is indeed showing up. So this is definitely the array that is actually getting rendered to the screen. Now that we have our data passed into options, let's go ahead and figure out where else we need to use it. This array does need to get used inside of action. So the action component is what's going to render the what should I do button, and that button should only be enabled if there are actually items in the array, if the array length is greater than 0. If the array length is 0, we want to disable that button. Now there are two ways we could go about getting this information into action. We could pass down the entire options array, and inside of action, we can check the length of that array. But action doesn't need the individual items. It really just needs a Boolean value. Are there any options at all? Yes or no. I don't care what they are. I just need to know if there are options in the array. To do that, we can go ahead and set up a prop along the lines of has options. Has options is going to be true if there are options and false if there aren't. And then action can go ahead and use that Boolean to determine whether or not the button should be disabled or enabled. Right here, we're going to go ahead and access this .state.options. We're going to grab its length, and we are going to check if it is greater than 0. So if it is greater than 0, this is going to resolve to true, meaning that has options would be true. If it is 0, this will be false, meaning has options will be false. Now, before we go ahead and actually save the file, let's make sure to use has option inside of action. That lives down here. So what are we trying to do with that data, with that new prop? We're just trying to disable or enable the button. So we can set that up. Before I add on disabled, I am going to reformat this since we're going to be adding a few attributes. I'm going to stick to the formatting we've explored so far, looking like this, and that allows me to add on other attributes without going off to the right-hand side of the screen. So right here, we want to disable the button using disabled, and we are going to pass in as its value a JavaScript expression. If it's true, the button will be disabled. If it's false, it won't. Now we want to access the prop, that is this .props.has options, and remember this is going to be true if there are options, which means it'll be disabled. We actually want to flip that. So we're going to flip it using the logical not operator. Now we can go ahead and save app.js, and we should see the button is indeed enabled because there are items. But if I were to scroll up to the very top of the file and comment that stuff out and put an empty array in instead, we should see the button is disabled, and that is exactly what we get. So everything with action is working really well so far. We've passed the options state down into action and options. Does header need it? Nope. Does add option need it? It does not need it. So now we're moving on to a more interesting problem, which is how to manipulate this array. In our previous examples, this was never a challenge because we had a single component. The single component just registered a click handler or a form submit event, and then in its callback method, it just called this .setState. But in our case, we have children that need to be able to manipulate the state up here in the parent. For example, add option. Add option needs to be able to get that text from the user, and it needs to manipulate this piece of state. It's got to add something onto the array so that can actually get rendered. Now, options itself also needs to be able to manipulate the state. It needs to be able to remove an individual option or remove all of them. All of that is going to require us to run some code up here based off of events that actually trigger down below. Now, how exactly are we going to do this? Because we know that props are a one-way street. Props can get passed from a parent to a child. So Indecision app can pass props to any of these guys, but these guys cannot pass props upstream. To solve this problem and to reverse that one-way data flow, we're going to pass functions in as props. So we're going to define a method right here, something along the lines of handle delete options. This is going to have all of the logic for wiping the array using this .setState. We're going to pass that in wherever it's needed, and that child component, it can call the function that gets passed down as a prop to actually take that action. In this case, it'll be able to delete all of the options from the array. So let's go ahead and actually do this. Step one is going to be to define a method like we did in the previous videos. We're going to define a method. The method we'll call this .setState. Right here, handle delete options. This is going to delete all of the options. It is going to completely wipe the array. I'm going to set up that method, and it doesn't need to take any arguments. We don't need any data in order to set the array equal to an empty array. We are going to be using this .setState, and we are going to be passing in that updater function. Now, do we need the previous state to calculate the new one? Nope. So we can just go right ahead and return an object. And on this object, we're going to set options equal to an empty array. And there we have it. Nothing earth-shattering. This should look pretty familiar based off of what we did in the last several videos. The tricky part is that the button that's going to get clicked to trigger this, it doesn't live inside of this render method. So what we're going to do is we're going to pass it down into options where the button does live. Now, since we are adding on multiple props, I am going to break this out onto multiple lines. So right here, below the first options prop, we're going to add on a new one, and I'm going to call this one handle delete options. So we're creating a new prop, handle delete options, and we're going to set it equal to the method we just defined, this .handle delete options. And now we're going to have access to this method via this prop name down inside of the options component. So let's go ahead and actually do that. Down here in options, we currently define our own method for handle remove all. We're actually going to delete this completely. This is not going to be on options itself. We're also going to delete the constructor function. If we're deleting the method, there's no reason to bind it. So we're going to wipe all of that stuff, leaving just the render method in place. Now, currently, right here, we go ahead and access a method that doesn't exist anymore. So we're going to remove that reference, and on click, instead of firing this the method on options, it is going to be this props, the method that got passed down. Now we just called that one handle delete options. Now remember, we don't want to call it, we just want to reference it. It'll get called when the remove all button gets clicked. When that button gets clicked, it is going to call this method. The method lives up here, and that is going to wipe the state. Now, like all of our event handlers, we do want to make sure to bind this to the correct instance right here. This handle delete options needs to equal itself handle delete options, and then we're going to use bind to bind it to the current instance. Now, if we save app.js, we can actually test this out. So by default, yes, we do have our 3 options showing up. We currently have no way to add another one, but that's fine. Let's click remove all, and right there, everything goes away. So we have completely removed all of the options from the array, and we did that by taking a method, passing it down into a child component and having it called down there. That allows us to reverse the data flow. So instead of just being able to pass stuff into options, we can pass down a function, allowing options to do something in the parent. In this case, it says, hey, go ahead and delete all of the arrays. Trust me, the user clicked that button. Now, we've already seen component state cause an individual component to re-render, but you'll notice that this time around, when the state changes, obviously render gets called, but it causes child components to re-render as well. So what exactly is happening here? Well, what's happening is that options is getting re-rendered with a brand new set of props. Now, handle delete options didn't change, but the value for options did. So it's important to note that while a component like options cannot change its own props, new prop values can get passed down from the parent, and those will trigger a re-render in the child. So when we first explored props down below, we tried to manually set this.props.options equal to an empty array, and we got a really long error about how props are read-only, and they are, but it is perfectly valid for a parent to pass down new prop values. When the parent does, the child will re-render. That is why wiping the array causes all of the options to actually go away. Now that we've reversed this flow once together, let's go ahead and do it again as a challenge. Now that means you're going to make a new method on Indecision app and you're going to pass that down into one of our children. This time it's going to be action. Action needs to be able to let Indecision app know when someone clicked that button, and that means that the method up here needs to actually randomly pick one of the options and alert it to the screen. So I'll go ahead and outline that via comments. Step 1 is going to be to create the brand new method. We can call this something along the lines of handle pick. You're going to pass that down, pass down to action, and you're also going to bind it up here. So bind here. Now you're going to pass it down to action and set up on click. On click, we want to make sure to call that brand new prop. Now what exactly does handle pick need to do? Well, it is just going to randomly pick an option and alert it. We already have the logic for that over inside of JSX Indecision. Right here, we have the onMakeDecision method, and you can just reuse the logic. Obviously, the options array lives in a different place, but aside from that, we can use the exact same techniques. Now, down below, inside of action itself, we actually have a method right here, and we're no longer going to be using this method, so you can also go ahead and remove handle pick from action. Now, when you're all done and you wire up the correct method in onClick, the new prop, you should be able to actually click the what should I do button when there are items, and you should get the alert printing the actual option text. Currently, if I were to refresh the page, yes, we do have options, but if I click what should I do, I'm always going to get handle pick. This is where we want to show the individual option text instead. So take some time to knock this one out. Feel free to refer to any of the code we've written so far. Go back and watch any videos if you need to, and take your time. Pause the video, test your work, and when you're done, click play. How'd that go? I hope you were able to get that done without any trouble. Down below, I'm going to kick things off by defining handle pick. Handle pick is where we will eventually put all of the logic for randomly picking an option and alerting it. For now, though, I can always just alert test and make sure this is actually getting called. Then I'll worry about randomly picking the option. Now, if we are going to pass this down and register it inside of an onClick event handler, we do want to make sure to bind it. So up above, we're going to do just that. This.handlePick needs to get set equal to itself, this.handlePick, but we want to go ahead and bind it to the current component instance. Excellent. Now we can actually pass this down into action. We're going to do that right here. Now I'm going to choose to break this out onto multiple lines to keep things a little bit nicer. And right here, I will pass in handle pick, and I'm going to get its value from this dot handle pick. So now we're passing a function down as a prop. We can go ahead and call that whenever we want to. Down below, inside of action, as I mentioned, we're going to be removing the handle pick method we defined here. This is no longer going to be necessary. Instead, we're going to go ahead and just call the new prop we passed down. That is this dot props dot handle pick. This is going to correctly call the prop we just set up right here. That is going to correctly call this guy, and we should see alert test printing to to the screen. If we do, then we can go on and actually randomly pick one of the options. I'm going to click what should I do? Test shows up, which means everything is working correctly so far. Let's move on to the last part, which is to actually randomly select an option. Now we already have all of the code from that, and we already wrote and explored this code, so there's no need to rewrite it from scratch unless we really want to. I'm going to go ahead and grab these 3 lines and copy them, pasting them over here inside of handle pick. Now we do have to make a few tweaks. For example, app.options no longer exists. It is this.state.options. That's where we can get the length. Down below, we use app.options again, this.state.options. Perfect. We can keep random number, we can keep option, everything is looking really good. Let's go ahead and test this out by saving the file and actually clicking what should I do. I'm going to click it. What do we get? We get thing 2. I'm going to click it again. We get thing 2 again. And we can keep going through that process, getting new random items. And it all seems to be working really, really well. And we were able to do this by reversing that data flow. We allowed a child to communicate with the parent by calling the method. Now we could have passed data up, and this is something we'll explore in a little bit, but for now it's perfectly fine just to call the function and trigger that action. I'm going to remove the comments, and that is it for this video. So let's take just a quick moment to recap what we did. In this video, we set up state using tools and techniques that we already learned about. We already know how to set up default state in the constructor, and we already know how to use this.setState to manipulate that state. What we didn't know how to do is how to allow a child to communicate with its parent, because we know props are usually a one-way street. We fixed this by passing functions like handle pick and handle delete options down to the children. The children can then call those functions, which are defined up here, and that allows us to reverse the data flow. And this is a pattern we're going to see over and over again, including in the very next video. In the next video, we're going to continue knocking out features for the Indecision app, so stay tuned. I'll see you then.